Penguin Random House Audio presents Moonshot, Achieve the Impossible with the Apollo Mindset by Richard Wiseman. Read for you by Peter Noble.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade not because that will be easy, but because it will be hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. President John F. Kennedy, September 1962.
Liftoff. Open almost any book about how to achieve your aims and ambitions, and you will quickly encounter stories of genetically gifted Olympians, hard-headed CEOs, and risk-taking entrepreneurs. This book presents a radically different perspective on success. It's based around a group of young and surprisingly ordinary people. Their inspirational story is little known, and yet they played a central role in humanity's greatest achievement. Perhaps most important of all, once you understand how they did what they did, you can follow in their footsteps and achieve the extraordinary in your own life. As a psychologist, I've spent much of my career examining why some people and organizations are especially successful. A few years ago, I became interested in the moon landings, and was astonished to discover that although the technology used during the missions has been extremely well documented, very little has been written about the psychology that lies behind this remarkable achievement. As I started to dig deeper, I encountered several other big surprises. On the 21st of July, 1969, Apollo astronaut Neil Armstrong gently set foot on the powdery surface of the moon. Live images of this historic event were beamed back to the Earth, where over 500 million people watched in wonder. Just 8 years before, President John F. Kennedy had appeared in front of Congress and famously declared that before the decade was out, America would put a man on the moon. Looking back, it's hard to fully appreciate the enormity of the goal. When the president made his historic announcement, America had only managed to send one astronaut on a 15-minute up-and-down suborbital flight. Kennedy's bold vision required several astronauts to journey over 380,000 kilometers across space, land on a distant and hostile world, and safely make their way back home. Even modern-day space travel pales in comparison, with the Space Shuttle and International Space Station traveling only around 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth. Moreover, Kennedy's goal had to be achieved within a few years, and at a time when the latest cutting-edge technology consisted of slide rules and mainframe computers with less processing power than a modern-day smartphone. To many, Kennedy's dream appeared to be truly impossible. Nevertheless, hundreds of thousands of people came together and attempted to transform that dream into reality. They invented new forms of technology, overcame setbacks and tragedies, and built spacecraft containing millions of bespoke parts. Against astonishing odds, the moon landings were a spectacular success and provided the world with an unparalleled sense of optimism and hope. For most of us, mention of the Apollo landings conjures up images of white-suited astronauts carefully making their way across the lunar surface. While these brave and heroic individuals are obviously essential to the success of Apollo, they are far from the full story. Watch any documentary about the moon landings and you will soon see images of mission control. A huge room packed with consoles, giant screens, and people wearing headsets. This impressive setup lay at the heart of the space program. The mission controllers never donned a spacesuit or traveled to a distant world. Instead, they wore everyday clothes, kept their feet firmly on the ground, and often hid away from the public gaze. Nevertheless, they were central to the success of the entire enterprise. Imagine that you're living in the early 1960s and have been charged with putting a person on the moon by the end of the decade. The whole world will be watching, and the nation's reputation is on the line. What sort of people would you recruit for mission control? Maybe you would go for highly experienced scientists and engineers, or people who've graduated from the country's most prestigious universities and colleges. Amazingly, hardly anyone in mission control had any of these attributes. Instead, most of the controllers came from modest, working-class backgrounds and were often the first in their families to go to college. Perhaps most surprising of all, they were astonishingly young. In fact, when Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon, the average age of the mission controllers was just 26 years. The group had few of the qualities that we commonly associate with success, and yet somehow they managed to accomplish the seemingly impossible. I wanted to discover why, from a psychological perspective, mission control was such a hotbed of success. And I was fortunate enough to be given the opportunity to interview several key controllers. Now in their 70s and 80s, they were all remarkably generous with their time and thoughts. My interviewees had seen history in the making and had fascinating stories to tell. They were also a great deal of fun. During one interview, for instance, I asked the controller whether it was true that the group was trained to communicate using the fewest number of words possible. After a brief pause, he replied, "Yes." I eventually discovered that their breathtaking achievement was due to a unique mindset. Combining the interviews with mission archives and academic research, I identified the 8 principles that I believe make up this remarkable and highly effective approach to life. You're about to discover how Kennedy's dream became a reality. Along the way, you will relive historic events and rub shoulders with a group of ordinary people who achieved the extraordinary. During the journey, you will encounter the key psychological principles at play, including how the seeds of success were sown in the president's charismatic speeches, how pessimism was crucial to progress, and how fear and tragedy were transformed into hope and optimism. Perhaps most important of all, you will discover a series of practical techniques that you can use to incorporate these winning principles into both your professional and personal life. Whether you want to start a business venture, change careers, find your perfect partner, raise a loving family, get promoted, gain a new qualification, escape the rat race, or pursue a lifelong passion, these techniques will help you to reach your own moon. Chapter 1. We Choose to Go to the Moon, where we discover how an entire nation fell in love with a mission to the moon and find out how you can harness the power of passion. In October 1957, America's CBS television broadcast the first episode of what was to become an iconic sitcom, Leave It to Beaver. The program celebrated 1950s American family life and revolved around the adventures of 8-year-old Theodore Beaver Cleaver. Getting the program on air hadn't been easy. The producers had initially wanted to open with an episode in which Beaver ordered a pet alligator and then hid his new reptilian pal in the toilet tank of his parents' bathroom. However, broadcasting guidelines recommended that bathrooms and toilets weren't shown on television, and the CBS chiefs became nervous about airing the episode. After much wrangling, the producers offered to re-edit the alligator episode and only to include a few shots of the offending toilet. Unfortunately, the editing took longer than expected, and so the network was forced to air an alternative debut episode. Oblivious of the controversy, millions of Americans came home from work on Friday, the 4th of October, 1957, and chuckled away as Beaver became convinced that he was going to be expelled from school, hid up a tree, and then attempted to make amends by presenting his teacher with a rubber shrunken head. It all seemed like harmless fun. In reality, the program's safe and secure worldview was just days away from being
Sample complete. Ready to continue?